we thought of talking about today. It brings us, it puts in the center of possible practice something that is kind of circling around for a long time, which is that idea of the platform that is kind of automated with making visible the relationship.
That was one of the most interesting ideas when I came into the circle, to have this automated platform. Also the money, the circle money. I was very interested in that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that if the circle kind of it accepts that it has this function of being a sort of common forum for a bunch of organization experiments, and it's focusing on that, and it's not really unifying the subsets. That sort of project becomes like it can easily become like something we push forward, you know? And I think it can also do something else that we wanted to talk about, which is there will come a moment in this whole discussion we're having here where doing case studies and like seeing how this reverberates with people's political experience and things like this will be like, it'll be hard to avoid it, you know? And again, I think that the fact that the circle is also moving in that direction of being a forum for that thing might also facilitate bringing people here to present, or creating like a compilation of different reports of experiences and stuff, right? So there's also that. Anyway, Reza is here. Thiago didn't answer me. I'm not sure if he's coming.
Yeah, Pedro didn't answer either.
Yeah, so I imagine that they are not, right? John said he wouldn't. So first of all, I want to congratulate us all for writing a text. That's good. Everyone can put it in their CV. It should be published by next month. I'm a bit worried that people are gonna feel like it was too utilitarian, because the issue is like pandemic, coronavirus, and in our text.
No. I justified this. I brought in the justification for the paper to be there, so it's okay.
This section, yeah.
I take credit for that.
But you know,
one section about the pandemic in that paper.
That's our alibi.
Yeah, that's our alibi. But I sent that version, Caron, and Agon was like very, very carefully telling me like, yeah, but you know, like nobody's gonna believe you. Can you put something in the beginning about it? And then I added like 2 paragraphs. Like, whoa, guys, the pandemic, huh? Really serious stuff. By the way, and then something else.
Yeah.
I thought we could have called the text and now for something completely different. You know, the Monty Python sketch. But yeah, it's probably coming out soon, because from what I hear, they're already finishing the design and so on. So we'll be able to refer to that in the future if anyone wants to know what's going on. We can say, yeah, there's a published thing, and they can deal with the complicated presentation there. I mean, we didn't have a schedule for today, but I think that besides all our usual speculation in these general meetings, one thing we could do, I'm not sure what you guys think of it, but what is to kind of plan not only the schedule, because I think that we have already, I'll just share with you guys here. This is what was, where is it? Oh my God. Here. This is what we have kind of pre-planned for the future, right? As I suggest, like, okay, these 3 things here, we haven't even spoken with these people yet. I think we can add them.
I did speak to Patricia. She was okay with doing it, but there was a problem with the time schedule or something.
Yeah, but I mean, in any case, we have. I know you wanted to add one as well, right, Caron?
Yeah. I think I like that paper. I think that paper I sent is quite interesting and it connects quite well with the things I've been studying, and maybe it will be also an interesting contribution to the group. And maybe to pair it with the presentation on Mark Wilson and scale, I think they go quite well together because it's got this framework, Pittsburgh Hegelianism framework going on. So I guess a couple of presentations on that would be nice on my side, I think. Pedro wanted to do it with me, but he's not here, so I don't know. We'll have to talk to him later about this. But yeah.
Yeah, because what I was gonna suggest is simply that you then add here the stuff, and then we can start seeing. Because, for example, it seems to me that these two here should go close together, right? Raquel's on price, and Dennis also wants to talk about price. Perhaps Renzo and mine could go closer together. Well, whereas
I guess mine and Reza go.
Yeah. So you see,
mine and Reza go. Yeah.
So we could kind of organize the schedule so that these things fit together. So I think that's one thing we should talk about, how to do that. Another thing that was brought up, Raquel brought this up, and I think we should talk about it as well, is that I know the Badiou reading group is finishing, and probably tomorrow we're gonna talk about further readings and things like this. But one of the readings we propose to do there, which is to read Bogdanov's book on tectology, is quite connected to the stuff we're doing here. So one thing that was suggested was to have the reading of that book as a sort of recurrent, like monthly meeting. So we have presentations, general discussions, but every once a month, we have the Bogdanov discussion. Like we agree to read a certain section and then we discuss it. So it would give us a more clear guiding line throughout the work as well, like to have almost like a reading section, that would be a way to integrate the two things a bit more rather than have one meeting on Monday, one meeting on Tuesday, even though the topics become more closely connected. I don't know. So I think that's another thing for us to discuss, what you guys think about that, because I think that for some people reading Bogdanov's work might make clear sense, but for others perhaps it's not very obvious. If you guys want, we can have that discussion also after I present on Bogdanov, just so you guys have like a sense of what the hell is going on there. I don't know.
Well, I am interested in that right away, so I'm okay with that idea.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, I don't know, like, is anyone not interested? Because, for example, if we're all gonna read it together, it might be the case that I don't even present on him, I present on something else, because we're gonna read them together. Why the hell have that presentation,
Yeah.
And so one other thing that I thought of presenting instead, and in fact it connects even with the project of the platform and so on, is that I'm publishing this book in Portuguese with a friend, and the book is it's not kind of, it's very much in the line with a lot of stuff we're doing. I thought of translating one of the chapters and presenting on top of it, because it pretty much connects with that whole thing with the multi-layered transcendental or how to talk about different forms of organization using that. So I could lose the Bogdanov and we turn it into a monthly, or I don't know how frequent you guys would prefer, but like a underlying common commitment, and we add that as a recurring thing,
Wait, what's this book you're translating?
Yeah, I wrote a book. I don't know how it would be called in English. It's actually going to be translated to English apparently at some point, but
oh, nice.
Yeah, it's called like an architecture made of corners. I don't know how we translate Aresta into English, but it's a book it proposes a model of how to analyze leftist organizations using the theories that left uses to analyze other things. So we use a lot of theory that people use for discussing capitalism, money, and things like this, and we use them to look at the left itself. But it connects with a lot of stuff we're doing. So it would be similar to the organizational point of view. I could substitute that presentation for this easily, and could do it already next week or whatever. So anyway, I think that this is something to discuss if everyone is cool with that idea. I'm not sure if, since some people are not here, perhaps we could decide through the WhatsApp group, right? So other people are also part of that discussion. But
yeah, can you do polls in WhatsApp?
I'm not sure. We can do a fake poll, right?
Yeah, we'll just do a fake poll.
Yeah, in the sense that I'll just post like a message saying, what do you guys think about this? And this is the book we suggest. If you have another suggestion, repost this post and add your suggestion, and you will see the one that is the most voted.
Can we exercise early voting or mail-in ballots?
Yeah, of course. Do you have a alternative proposal?
No. I think Bogdanov is quite good. I had suggested that we continue with Badiou, but in a different vein, by reading more into Lautzman. So like you, I like to present a little bit of Lautzman and provide some contrast between axiomatic and dialectical frameworks, the way that I understand them. So I'm quite fond of spending some time reading some Lautzman.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that the idea of having an underlying common reading is not to filter everything we do to that, but let's say we have, for example, in this list here, we have, I don't know, 6 presentations, right? So imagine that we do 1, 2, 3, then the 4th is the Bogdanov. Then we do again 5, 6, 7, then the 8th is the Bogdanov, right? So it's not to, if you want to present stuff on Lautzman, we can still have them. And if you want to present many times on the same topic, every month you propose a new version of the Lautzman stuff, you can do it. Why not?
Okay,
right?
That sounds good.
Yeah, I think it's not so much a matter of kind of censoring the other proposals. It's just making sure we have like a common thread we can. And part of the reason is also, we were talking about this, part of the reason is that it's very hard to introduce people into the perspective we're taking, because there's not much bibliography that addresses that exact point of view. And Bogdanov seems to be perhaps the closest. So people knowing that that's a book that is being read together might also help them feel more in tune with the group as we go, right? Even if they're not aware of everything that was already done before, right? So I think that I'll put on WhatsApp this discussion on the common reading. As for I'll just change here mine.
I'll suggest a second one.
And I think that, so the common reading is one topic. The second topic is the schedule, making sure that we are happy with it. I don't mind presenting next week. I think I can do it. Let me see if I'm saying shit. No, okay. I can do it next week. And so on the 9th, I wonder if anyone already wants to volunteer for presenting next, or should we leave that you guys want to do it afterwards?
Não sei usar essa porra.
Is it for next week?
Yeah, I can present next week already.
Okay.
But you don't, I mean, just, we said that my presentation might have something to do with Renzo's and your has something to do with Raquel, but of course, like people need different times to prepare, feel free. But it's just a good thing for us to already start imagining possible dates here to put here. So doesn't need to be done now, but it would be good to be doing this in the next couple of days, you know?
Yeah, I think mine is it makes more sense once the Bogdanov thing is already.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So for example, if let's say that the Bogdanov thing is approved, we could do something like next week I present, then the next week we do the first reading.
I think this sounds good for me, I think.
Okay, so I'll just add here, it's not defined by, but so this would be like with a regular frequency or something. But so that's the second thing. The third thing to talk about, I think, is until now we haven't really worried about having, like, say, a public face, right? Or trying to like have a website or publicizing when we meet. But I know that for already this week, there was the idea that some people might join or might join next week, and like just to watch and to see if they want to join later on. We could, I think it might be a good time now that this new text is coming out as well. We could start thinking about, I don't know, just having some a visible online platform where we put all these videos and resources and things like this. I think on the simpler side of this, just adding the material and perhaps adding a very short introduction to what is going on would help kind of people who are arriving late to feel more kind of up to speed with the whole thing. And if we do something more complex than that, for example, we have this thing here, right? I think you guys can see it from there. Like I used it on the text as well, right? I updated it to actually have the meetings with it. This is a sort of, it kind of maps the meetings and the sort of stuff we covered in the meetings, right? But for example, if we set up some basic rules on how what these meetings need to cover so that they are part of the project, it might be the case that we have presentations where not all of us are present or that happened outside of a regular schedule, and that insofar as they are doing some basic stuff like connecting with the previous material or addressing similar bibliography or something like that, that they are seen as part of this ecosystem, right? So one thing the simple version of creating a platform would be just to help people to get introduced to the project and to give it a public face. And the more complicated version of it would be to create something that facilitates a bit more of autonomy. So, I don't know. I don't think it's a matter of creating new groups that only meet separately. But, for example, I don't know, Reza wants to meet more than once to talk about Lautmann and dialectics and axiomatics. We could address this in a different way and say, okay, it might be the case that not everyone joins him for that meeting, for that presentation, but as long as that presentation has some sight or some vision of how it connects with this discussion, it should be on the same platform, and might invite other people there, and things like this, you know. So it might give a field that is more of an open research that others might contribute, right? And to the point that if somebody that's not here does a presentation or a discussion that touches on the same topics, we could include it there as well, right? So I don't know. I think that that's another topic for us to see what you guys think. You know, if we should try something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to just make like a website similar to the STP one, right?
Yeah, something like that. And I mean, I would even put the link now to the Badiou reading group there, because it seems like the logic is actually inverted, right? It's easier to embed having read Badiou's logics of roles as part of this bigger thing than the inverse.
Yeah, Badiou fits as one of these.
Yeah, you can
branches.
still develop it further if you want. And for example, it's easy to imagine, for example, if the dialectics and axiomatic, I do think it fits, but let's say it didn't, right? Let's say there's some crazy stuff you want to do on Badiou Reza that is hard to fit here. It could fit like coming out of here, right? It's a further development on that. I mean, it's possible. So I don't know, we could imagine it almost like either a website just to introduce people, or a website to give you like a mapping, you know, of, well, if you can pull a string to one of these directions, well, do it, and we will add it, and it's fine.
I think at the end it is good to have a website for all these individual researchers to come under. Whether we present that here or multiple times, or even set up a different group, is something that we can discuss. Like, for example, Dennis and I are reading this topology book, which is completely different than this. Nothing may come out of it.
It can fit into the space and logic section.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the idea, right?
Put it down there.
Yeah.
It's a good book. It's a good book.
For me, it's very dense, though. I know for
Yeah.
you guys probably it is. It's a starter, but for me, sometimes it moves very fast, especially in the examples.
Oh, it definitely moves fast. I agree. It's succinct. That's good. But yeah, I think this is a good idea. Honestly, like just have this as the website, and just have links to all of the kind of subsets and groups and sub-presentations or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think something like that could work. And one other thing that I think is useful is the following, because, for example, we're always meeting in English, but there's a good bunch of people here who are not native English speakers, and could perhaps, you know, there are people we could invite that perhaps it's not possible to do it in English, and it would be worth having a place where meetings that don't really fit everyone, but clearly have something to do, and we can bring the result of that meeting back in a general meeting and discuss it, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Can also function, I don't know. Yeah, but anyway, I think that...
In that case, should the website also be bilingual?
Yeah, I think we could do, it's not, I mean,
Yeah.
I can easily translate this stuff, and we can even do it like this, like when it's written in another language, it's in that language, right?
Yeah, any text and so on, yeah.
Yeah, because you can see that these things are in, yeah. But anyway, I think that this is, generally it's a good idea, just because there is now something public that has to do with the group. We could just use this momentum to also do this already, and have this kind of, I can then also on the WhatsApp group, just ask who wants to help out coming up with this. I know Pedro works with this as well. Maybe he's interested in just pitching in or something, just so we can actually make this public, not take that long or spend too much effort on it, you know. But I think it also helps as a calling card for people who we might want to invite, right, later. And I think that on the invitation part, there is a fourth point, which is, for now, we thought of inviting people who have theoretical views that are interesting or have some dialogue with what we're discussing. But there's also the fact we could invite people who have practical experience that also connects with these discussions, right? So I was talking to Renzo and to Raquel, and we were thinking about some experiences with cooperatives here in Brazil that would be interesting to have people to talk a bit about it. And I spoke with a friend of mine who was part of this really big Venezuelan cooperative called Secunda, which is like a huge cooperative experiment there. And he was also interested in presenting something. So we could, I don't know, include in our schedule also that sort of thing, right? And for this, it would be good to have a public page so people know what they're getting into when they come talk to us.
Yeah, sure.
And Lucas was coming today, but he couldn't. But he was participant in a movement very important in 2013 here in Brazil. So I think he could say something on that for us.
I think it was actually him that translated the Apolito's text, right?
Yeah.
Ah, cool. This is something we could already do here on this schedule then, perhaps. Like, I know he wanted to see one meeting before he presents, so he could come next week. And the next week after that, we already reserved for him to talk.
Yeah, maybe I can talk. I have to talk to him. But
yeah, of course. But I'll just add him as a possible guest.
Okay.
The only thing is mentioned that the English could be a.
Yeah.
I can do simultaneous translation if needed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like from this sort of more institutional side, I think those are the stuff for us to talk about. You know, other than that, I think it's yeah. There's just one more thing that actually connects with all of this, because and it's also something that you know, Dennis and I, we have been meeting and frying the brains over that whole capital reading thing. But last time we met, and we're trying to move our discussion a bit more to the political organizational side and not only to the reading of capital. And we were talking, I think we made some nice progress on that, but at the end of it, I saw myself giving some stuff of the circle as some examples coming from our experience in the circle to try and give more concrete contours to the whole thing. And one of those examples I actually didn't mention, but I think it has everything to do with the project, is the whole idea of that automated platform that we many times tried to take off the ground, but never really managed to. And I think that this is something we could also put in our kind of future purview if we wanted, like not so much as a theoretical discussion aspect for the meetings, but actually like just as the Bogdanov thing meets every month, if this turns out to be something that interests everyone, it is very much a practical project. We can talk about it a bit more in a second, but it's very much a practical project that touches on a lot of stuff we were debating, you know. I know Renzo already did work on it. I know Dennis and we discussed it a long time ago. And Caron also knows a lot about it because of the circle promoting this idea. But it could give like a sort of very solid kind of parallel project, you know, to be developed slowly as we go. But Yasha, I think you and Reza don't know about it then. And
yeah, I wanted to ask, could you say more about what you mean by this automated platform thing? Caron mentioned it was an interesting idea. So.
Yeah, a long time ago, because I think the best way to explain it is the following: like this, there is this collective that I'm part of and other people here are part of called the Circle of Studies of Idea and Ideology. And one of the specific proposals of that collective is that it doesn't really discern who its members are based on ideological preference. We have some basic rules for organization that we say that if you follow those rules, you are part of the collective. If you don't follow, you're not, but it doesn't matter what you think about them while you're following them. So there are some basic rules on how things are organized, and pretty much it's like this. Imagine it's like this. You have what we call a cell, and a person is a member of the cell if after every meeting they write what we call a work note, like some comment on the meeting, right? So they belong here so let's say this is a meeting. If they write after the meeting, they write this work note that is then read in the next meeting. And you remain inside the group as long as you write these work notes. So every meeting you write a new one, and then you belong to the group. If you stop writing those notes for some period of time, we understand that you're outside. So it's not like a emblem that you need to have to belong to the group. It's just a commitment you need to restate every time. That's what makes you part of the group. So this set of meetings here, this is what we call a cell. Now, once you're part of the group, these meetings, they are very fluid because it's very heterogeneous, right? Like these two guys here who belong, they might be totally different politically. One is an anarchist, the other is like a Lib Dem, whatever, we don't care, if you follow this rule. But once you have this heterogeneous cell, and you have more than one, for example, with many meetings inside, right? You can create subgroups or subsets based on common projects. So for example, let's say that this guy here in this meeting and some other guy here on this meeting, they like studying topology and they want to read that crazy book you guys are reading. So they form a subgroup, and now this group has some consensus, right? It is more homogeneous. It has some common goal in mind. So these guys are here. And we create a lot of subsets in this way. That's why this group that was reading Badiou was called subset, because it was created in that way, right? So homogeneity appears here, whereas there's a lot of, it's very heterogeneous, the sort of groups you have in these cells, right? So you see the whole collective is structured like cells that are conditioned by these work notes. You belong if you write it, you don't belong if you don't write. But once you belong, you can create groups that have common interests with you, right? And we create we used to create, we're having trouble with that now because the group became too big and there is no common forum where all these subsets and cells meet. So we can have some sort of overview of what's going on. There's too much going on separately and it's hard to kind of unify. But anyway, our basic idea was we realized that these rules here, because they're very formal, they can be programmed into a platform. They don't need to be upheld by people. You don't need like a administrative manager checking if the notes were sent, or you don't need somebody kind of personally approving the creation of these subsets and then adding them to our website to make them visible. You could have a platform that has these rules built into them, right? So the project, this idea of a platform began just with the idea of lowering the energy, the efforts that go into maintaining this collective and benefiting from the fact that it has very simple rules behind it that govern its complexity. And we have two problems today. It's too complex for somebody to do it all. It's very hard for somebody to even if every cell has like a manager, it's still very hard to keep track of all the work notes. It's been 10 years that every week 40 to 50 people write work notes. If you go onto our website, there's like, I don't know, 3,000 small notes written by people every week on the weirdest political topics, because the content of the note doesn't really matter. You can write about whatever you want. And then all these subsets and making sure everyone knows what they're doing. Like, it's hard for somebody just manage all of that. And the second problem we had is that the collective becoming invisible to itself, becomes very opaque, because one part of the collective doesn't know what the other part is doing, doesn't know if they can contribute, if something is going wrong. It's very hard to give a mapping of the collective. So the basic idea was, well, creating a platform that has these rules built into the platform solves both of these problems. On the one hand, it's automated, so the effort of managing is kind of lowered, right? And it makes it visible, because everything that is in the collective is what is on the page, right? The page is not a representation of reality. It is actually part of what is making the collective exist. So that was the very basic idea. But quickly we realized that if that platform existed and it was a bit more flexible, it could actually serve for many organizations, and not just for ours, not just for our organization with these rules, right? So I think that's also where Renzo came in, because he also developed, I remember talking to him, and he went much further with this idea than we did. But it is a project that actually binds together many of the stuff we're talking about, especially for people who just finished reading Logics of Worlds, like Reza and Caron as well. The whole discussion on bodies and organs, it fits this very well. Like the problem of how to connect projects that are heterogeneous amongst each other, and their efficacy comes from different places and different forms, but ultimately they have some sort of common background that is not natural. It needs to be constructed as well, right? It falls into our problem of a sort of economic dimension of politics, because the problem of connecting cooperatives, well, how cooperative projects, cooperative productive units relate outside of their own internal space? It's through money, because there is no way of making visible other forms of economic exchange, right? Or how is it that collectives negotiate with their constraints, like with other collectives? It's also very opaque, because you have no access to, let's say, an alternative form of mediation, right? So it is a project that is very concrete. It could definitely help a lot of organizations. It plays onto a lot of weaknesses of the left, right? People say there's no transparency, organizations are clearly hierarchical, there's no way to guarantee some level of equality, because quickly things become opaque and only clear for people on top, right? But it also addresses these other problems we're talking about, like how to create forms of mediation amongst smaller units that doesn't require you to lower the complexity to that level, but actually keeps track of complexity as it increases, right? In a sort of decentralized way. So it is a project that, I mean, exists. It's on the shelf right now, stored. Nobody's messing with it. We could pick it up as well, right? Not necessarily as something we do by meeting every week to talk about it, but it could definitely become like a concrete instantiation or a concrete experiment based on a lot of ideas we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, one example from what you just said. I actually haven't seen what Renzo you've been doing on this, but I had this idea about this platform where we could actually create a way to easily extend the rules of every organization such that anyone could write their own rules, and it could be fed into the system and become an automated thing. if we have the basic constituent elements like notes, members, cells, and so on, if we codify those, we could actually create our own kind of mini language grammar, and someone, without needing to, ask the programmer to do something, they could just create like a plugin or a layer onto the platform that applies to, certain members, something like that. So that it could be truly decentralized, right?
Yeah, Renzo's thought of that as well.
Nice, yeah.
So you're saying, so the subset we had for logics of words, the members of the subsets always have to belong to a cell?
Yeah, they used to, Reza, but that's part of the reason why I think you weren't in the meeting yet, but I was saying that right now in the circle, we are going through a reformulation because it became clear that sometimes we have people in the subgroups that are not part of any cell. They're not interested in being part of this common forum or things like this. And we're rethinking how this connection should be thought of the projects and the main forum. So we're actually going through a reformulation that mirrors in some way the very idea of this platform of it's more important to make sure that there is a place where organizational issues of different projects can be discussed if that's the case. And for example, this exists, a lot of business universities have this sort of incubators for small companies, right? Where a bunch of companies present their kind of startup projects and where they are at with it for a common audience, and they discuss those projects. For more conservative or business-minded organizations, this sort of concern is an old one. We don't have an equivalent for projects that have other concerns than just healthy business, right? So the circle is kind of like that throughout the times. That's what we became. Like, there's a lot of projects with very different kind of outlooks. We have subsets that deal with trade unions, with schools, with anarchist groups, with reading groups as well, theory and stuff, and they all meet through the cells because they're all part of the cell somehow, right? That's our basic mode of functioning. But today we're starting to reformulate that because in reality that's not how it's been working. People are not obliged to be part of a cell. A lot of activity that goes on these subsets is never brought back to any common forum to be kind of compared and confronted with different stuff and some commonalities to be found, you know.
So what is this called, the Monday meetings, in terminologies?
I don't know. That has nothing to do with the circle or anything like that.
It has nothing to do with the circle?
No.
Just organically formed.
Yeah, it was just, I like it in Portuguese, Monday is Segunda, and Segunda also means like second rate, you know. Every time somebody asks me what this is, I call them, it's like second rate meetings, like meetings of the Segunda.
So the platform that was, so not the platform, the manifest that was published or is being published is for this group, not the circle.
No.
Okay.
The circle today, it's too big. Like it's impossible to publish a manifesto in the name of this collective because there is not enough homogeneity. It's not a principal ultrafilter. There is no one common thing that somebody can speak in the name of it. It's just like, that's what we think it's nice about it. That structure we just talked about. Like the cells, they're very heterogeneous. They don't agree on anything. They're very, in fact, people are fighting all the time. And homogeneity is a second order thing that happens on smaller groups, right? So it's the inverse of what you get in, for example, party politics in Brazil, where the base is supposed to agree because it's part of the same party, and then they fight on the smaller groups inside the party. We do the inverse.
So what if we wanted to create a website and name this research group? What would we name it?
It's a good question.
So when I don't recall what we named it in the article.
We just said there's a research project with no name. And there was a lot of vague us and we. We are doing us, but not much more than that. But all of this to say that I do think I have the impression that if we want a more kind of hands-on counterpart to the discussions, the idea of this platform, as Dennis already said, like just to think what a platform like that would have to be. So let's say you want to program it and you need to program something that doesn't have specific rules for organization. For example, as we were saying, the circle has this particular structure. You are in the meeting, if you write work notes, that makes you part of the collective. And then if you want to create a subset, you need to fulfill some extra conditions, right? But that's just the circle. Let's say some other collective functions differently. I think generally a platform like this it has a political underlying force because it does push organizations towards trusting their forms more than their content, right? It is saying like, don't trust so much the guy who says he understands this or he represents that. It's a more, let's say, egalitarian thing. If you have some rules that will be applied regardless of what you're saying. So generally, I think it tends to kind of lean towards that direction. But inside that direction, you can imagine some other collective which functions in a different way, wanting to build something, like to build its structure on the platform itself. You would need like we would need to think, what are the basic building blocks, right? As Danny was saying, like, what's the basic grammar that's already programmed? And that would be the programmed part that people can combine to create a sort of organizational environment that is fitting to what they do, right?
Yeah, I remember when we talked, we came up with like 3 or 4 like test scenarios in which it would be nice if we would be able to kind of like if this tool would be able to kind of formalize and represent the workings of, I think it was like a cooperative, a study group like this, like the kind of like be able to formalize the functioning rules of
cooperatives, study
group, and then
there
like
was a school.
No, I think maybe the school, but also some form of like invisible like
a more clandestine sort of organization.
Exactly. Yeah. Clandestine organizations that need to some form of like security. They're like demand security of being able to be invisible and not showing.
Yeah. So I think one way of thinking that very concretely is that it shouldn't mean that just because a lot of organizations are using the same platform that you can see everything from everywhere, right? So you can imagine one organization that says only if you're a member of the organization you can see inside its structure on the website, whereas other organizations might want full transparency. So you don't need to be a member to see everything. It doesn't appear as a black box, right? Yeah.
But from the outside, you're able to say which kind of organization that is. If it's one that shows all its content, it has nothing to hide, or if it's some black box that you can see. And And from the like programming perspective, there are all sorts of challenges if you want to make it like safe and secure, and then there's all sorts of architecture on how you would implement this.
Yeah, and I think that from a theoretical standpoint, that's already a very concrete and complicated question. In fact, it touches very nicely on Caron's project as well, because I know he's very much concerned with rule following, rules and so on. But I mean, and also this whole trend on computation in philosophy. Well, if you imagine you had to create a platform that is able to simulate the environment for cooperative study groups, kind of small schools or institutions and clandestine groups, you would need to have a grammar with building blocks that are common to 4 very different forms of organization. It is pretty much a theoretical problem of what are the basic building blocks of organization, right? In terms of, and how do you frame them in terms of rules that can be implemented and things like this. So that I don't know. That's a as much as the reading of Bogdanov, for example. I can see this being like something we could, if it interests everyone, it could easily become something like every 2 months we meet and discuss this and share some tasks, and then we meet again a couple of months later. And I also think that this is the sort of thing that if we move to some level, like some threshold we should define, like, yeah, we think we have the basic view of this, we can communicate what we would need to some programmers. We could try to raise the money for this, because people knowing that this will be something that can be used by many organizations later on, that can take on the input of different organizations as it's being developed, we might be able to raise enough money to implement it, you know? So there's that. But I think we should approach it as a sort of practical added thing that might fit, might not. I think it really depends on how everyone feels about this idea. Otherwise, we can just also carry it forward separately. So, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very ambitious, the way you guys are talking about it. So definitely, I mean, I'm definitely interested in being involved in that.
Yeah, I'd be involved. I'd be interested in helping out with that. I mean, I think if we want to start something like that, definitely start like small at the level of the form, kind of the form that we would be using, and like what would be useful for us. But I mean, it's something that could be expanded. I don't really have a whole lot of web development experience. I don't know about you, Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, it's my day job.
I see.
Every time I want to start something, like I get so excited at the beginning, and then I realize it's going to be a shit ton of work.
Becomes a very big thing. Yeah,
and I stop. But
but I also think that, I mean,
we could talk about
if we were to try something like this, I think that we should probably focus on developing the intuition behind in a way that is not incompatible with making it real, but not really doing it, but enough that it can be presented to people who can then do it, and also to people who can actually invest on it, and then we take it forward, you know, rather than trying to solve everything on our own. I think it doesn't make any sense. Like, especially, it would be very ironic then is that you would just expand your day job. It would be, I don't think you need that. I mean, come on.
Yeah. But it would be good to, at least design it together, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's the same way that we could hear some people who are having interesting practical experiences that connect to this general outlook we've been talking about. It is a sort of, it's sort of the inverse vector, but it also mobilizes the same thing, right? It's equally a more concrete approach. It requires you to exercise a different part of your brain, you know, and to put this whole problematic into a more specific context. But I think that would be the part of it that fits this group, right? Actually carrying it forward and turning it into something that, you know, needs to raise some investment and then find people to implement it. I think that definitely goes beyond the scope of this. And part of thinking it through involves thinking in terms of steps, right? Of what should be done first, and what would be a small version of this that already shows promise, and then how to further develop it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but all of that said, one thing that I think we could use this meeting also to discuss a bit is that the text that we published, it had that we had a bit of a section for just to kind of go over the stuff the old stuff that I did with Dennis and things like this, but also to mention very shortly the presentations we already did, right? But there were some stuff that was left out that from personal interests of particular members of our meeting, like Caron brought into play some stuff that he wanted to add about aesthetics and scale and mapping, and it just seemed like we didn't have a chance to talk it over yet. So it seems to me that perhaps it would be also a good moment to make sure that we could use the text and the fact we wrote some of this to also make, I don't know, just raise problems, you know, and see what else we could, where else we could go, you know. Most of the presentations that we have now for the next kind of round, they're still very much grounded on the previous stuff we did, right? Or more like development and things. So I think that what Caron proposed about aesthetics, for example, is something we never discussed that much. I know Raquel has an interest on this connection between aesthetics and economics. I don't know, Caron, would you perhaps want to talk a bit about
yeah, it's not so much I guess it's not so much an interest in aesthetics per se, because of course I, as most of you know, I come from art and all of that, so at some point I was interested in scale sensibility within aesthetics, so I wrote some stuff about it. There's this paper about time stretching that people keeps asking me to comment upon and all that. This seem to have some resonance, but now the project, you know, morphed into some more general thing. You know, the thing that I was really wanting, I wanted to develop was the framework for the book that I was going to write, right? The form and scale stuff. So that was actually the first part of a more ambitious endeavor that has to do with the scale. But yes, it has something to do with aesthetic, maybe not in the sense of, you know, art anymore, but in the sense of visibility in general. So if you guys take a look at the section on the pandemic in the text, there is the mention of my text that I published in the Identities Journal about the pandemic. So that kind of investigation, like how you make visible something that is happening at a different scale, this is kind of important to me. But also, how do you get out of your own scale? Like, how do you bootstrap your sensible capabilities with the aid of the concept in order to assess different degrees, different scales of complexity and magnitude and all of that. So this is an ongoing project. Of course, it has something to do with aesthetics, but I was just pondering that it's not so much connected to art anymore, but to visibility and, you know, detectability as such, something like that. So this was, I think I added a couple of pages that didn't get into the published version of the article about that. It wasn't tethered anymore to, you know, philosophy of art, but it was more engaging with this problem of visibility that is also central to the article about the pandemic.
But it seems to me, just so you can also kind of push it forward, also as a question that I had for you, because like I think we could when we talk about, I mean, and I know that the whole thing with scales and stuff is a very broad topic, in fact, but it seems to me that there are two basic ways, or at least two consistent ways I already know of that we could talk about this, right? Because it seems like it is a crucial idea behind a lot of what we've been doing, that prices have a mediating role. And we want to understand a bit more about this mediating role that allows us to talk about other ways of doing it rather than the price system, for example. And not only prices do this, many things do this, but prices seems to be a very immanently political category of this. But it seems like there is also a distinction between mediations that help to bring the very large into your domain, right? To, let's say, our sensibility, right? Allows us to see something very big or very small. But there's also the processes that allow you to, as you said, go beyond your scale somehow.
Yeah.
But then there's also that distinction, I think, that is, for example, I think that many times the issue of scaling is treated in terms of big and small, but scaling actually concerns not only proportion, which is big and small, but also resolution.
Yeah.
Right? You can have the same picture seen in two resolutions. It's not big and small.
Yeah, of course.
It's the same size. So changes in resolution of things is not the same as changes in the large and small aspect necessarily. And it seems to me that what I would qualify as aesthetic in the way you talk about visibility and so on is that either in the vector that takes the smaller towards the big, or the vector that takes the big towards the small, it seems like it's the same things that it's connecting. So the resolutions are stable. So like the music is very long, you cannot hear it in a structural way and differentiate its moments, but it's still a piece of music and it's still a human listening. And the question still is about the sensibility of it all. It's not like about cutting it up in a different, like slicing experience in a way that you don't.
No, but I think both questions are related, because the question, if you're referring to of course, you're referring to the article. The questions are related because you lapse back into ambient listening because you don't find the proper resolution in order to maintain structural listening. So it has everything to do with that, because once you stretch a piece of, sound or whatever, or any temporal object that is given to sensibility, the tendency is that you start to perceive the grain, what we call the grain of the thing, and not the section, or not the relevant, the relevant part or the relevant section. Like music is a good example, because we tend to listen to music in analogy with verbal phrases. Like we tend to listen to phrases, right? A melody is like a phrase, so it has a beginning and an ending. Sometimes people talk about it in terms of questions and answers, or antecedents and consequence, something like that. But if you time stretch such a piece, you lose the phrases. So you enter into, some people would say sound itself. I don't get into that kind of mysticism, but you get into the grain of sound, like the grain of the timbre or things like that. So my issue there in that article was, I would rephrase it today, that structural listening was a product of finding the right resolution at a different scale that preserved the relationships between parts and whole. So I think the questions are related, even in that phenomenological sense. And that was of course, a paper on phenomenology, but there is also this engagement, with the Zalamea paper that, like, I tried to connect these two investigations, like in that classes I gave in your courses at PUC and all of that, with also a different kind of problem that doesn't have to do necessarily with big and small like how do you perceive the political as such, which is the question that Zalamea puts in the beginning of that paper, right? So this is a different issue, but it has something in common for me in my framework with the phenomenological one, in the sense that it has to do with certain seeings as, like certain classification of what you are seeing. So it's not just seeing, it's seeing in connection with a certain system of coherence that will make you see things in a certain way and see the connections in a certain specific way. So this has everything to do with resolution, I think. So I think the questions are connected in a sense. So yeah, I obviously I have the things I'm doing have a lot to do with what this group is about. I'm just trying to find my place within the specific, which interests me, but I'm not saying I'm not interested in that. I'm just saying that I'm still struggling to find a place within the specific economical problem that is kind of central here, right? So just because I didn't develop it enough yet. So
you know, one thing that I wanted to, I mean, I mean, I always struggled a bit with the sort of Wittgenstein way of dealing with the whole seeing as thing,
yeah.
Because it always seems to me that it requires you to keep things only. I mean, it's always the same subject shifting, and then objects appear differently, you know. But like, it needs to be who sees as, always people. Like, you can't really detach it from that, right? So that's why Zalamea's paper for me always seemed a bit like, just to tell people who haven't read it, like this very nice philosopher of mathematics called Fernando Zalamea. He has a text where he says in the beginning that he was passing, like, he uses as an example, he was walking in a tube station and seeing a lot of beggars in the kind of the corridor, and then he suddenly kind of saw that situation as something else, as if they were stones in a kidney, and the liquid is passing and the stones are in the way of like the normal flow, and but the stones that are in the way, they're also the product of the organism. And he said, well, that way of seeing it made it more political than just looking at people there. And so he introduces this idea of seeing things as, right, which is not simply making a metaphor, because it's not just, you're not comparing it with the previous way, you're actually taking it for a worldview or something like that.
How is it called, the article?
Wittgenstein Sheaves.
Okay.
I can send it to you. It's fantastic. I love this article, and it's so adventurous in its form as well. You'll see it.
Yeah, can you send it to the group?
Yeah, post it on our WhatsApp group.
Oh, I remember I actually read it a bit a couple months ago. I should go back to it.
Which
It
one?
was quite good. No, the Wittgenstein Sheaves one. I didn't realize that was the paper you were talking
about.
about.
Yeah. I think I posted like a couple of days. Every now and then I post this stuff again because it's one of my favorite articles of all time because I think it's so adventurous to have like theory written like that and all that. So there's
it was in Glassbead, that's why.
Yeah, it's in Glassbead, yes. And okay, I see what you mean about the centrality of the subject in that, but I disagree a bit. But in order to disagree, with a certain density, a big development is due. So, but because Wittgenstein is not really proposing anything based on the subject. He's proposing something based on language, and there are different things. And a language is not tethered to the individual subject in any sense. But also, this is the first thing I would say. A second thing I would say is that even if this Wittgensteinian framework is not developing what I think you are aiming at, which is the modifications in the object that obliges you to commit yourself to the to the relevant resolution, right? Something like that, like more objective phenomenological approach. Even if Wittgenstein does not talk about it, and by Wittgenstein, I'm not meaning only Wittgenstein. I mean, you know, this whole tradition that is the one that I'm most at home with, like Sellers, Brandon, all that. So even if he's not approaching it like explicitly, there is a place for that in a certain sense. You can make things with the gap between an object that is at a different resolution and your incapacity in order to grasp this object. Of course, this tends to reinstate, or this is the way I used to develop it, tends to reinstate something that is akin to the Kantian sublime. So it goes back to the 18th century and all that. But it is the object, nevertheless. It is something in the object that does not allow you to immediately grasp it. So you get this interesting dialectics between the behavior of the objects, the resolution that is the adequate resolution for a certain seeing as, and the scale, like some objects that are at a scale that are simply ungraspable in a certain sense, and they are only graspable by the concept, like by abstract thought, which is also a very, very important theme for me. I think something that I'm very interested in. So yeah.
But for example, in Zalamea, what I find ironic is that for him to see the political, he turns it into a human body. Like, you see my point. Like he does what kings and all ancient political philosophy does, which is to you want to see
very old-fashioned.
You want to see a body that is larger than you, like something larger than you. Allah, it has the form of your body, like.
You're right. The metaphor is old-fashioned. You're right about that. But I don't think this is, you know, necessarily methodological about the approach. No, I think it's just a metaphor that has a certain specific purport that tends to be kind of old-fashioned. Yes.
It's not old-fashioned. I mean, I don't think it's for nothing. I mean, economy was born like that. Like political economy was born as an operation.
It's a very powerful metaphor. Still today, yeah.
But one thing that I thought we could, just to connect also, when you said like I'm having a hard time finding a place in all of this, there is one thing I was talking to Dennis about that I just thought of bringing up now, because I think that in fact you're the one who is the closest, perhaps Pedro as well, because I understand he also likes Sellers and
we are kind of we are in this kind of
which is this thing here. Like, let me just show you guys very quickly. Where is it? Well, in those slides we used for the Badiou presentations, there is this way we formalize, or we propose a certain way of looking at what's called a labor process, right? Let me just find it here. And this way of doing it is nice because it facilitates understanding something else later on that is very important. So this is a formalization, a very kind of easy sketch. Let me just find it here. Way of sketching what Marx presents in Portuguese is chapter 5, but in English is chapter 7 of the first volume of Capital. Right? He writes how the production process happens, and he makes a double claim that is still today very, very much debated in Marxism, because he's saying that, well, on the one hand, he's worried about giving you the sort of basic components of a production process. You need the material, you need some land where you're going to work on, some instruments, you need to put in some effort, and the combination of these materials with these instruments on that land under some effort gives you some product, right? But he also tells you, like, yeah, but if you look at this, in fact, all the matter that goes into the product, all the what of everything here, the material, the raw material or pre-processed material comes through labor, through previous labor from earth. The land comes from earth and requires also some previous labor, in fact, to be adequate for some work. The instruments come from the land. The effort that you're able to exert depends on natural constraints of the body. So all the stuff that goes into the production process ultimately can be tracked back to the planet Earth, because there's no place else it could come from. But, he says, there is, whereas all of this is subjected to natural law, the design, the how of the production process comes through an added mediation, right? Nature produces all of this through itself, and everything is submitted to natural laws. But the how of the material, of the labor process, how you're going to combine these things, comes from a design that is actually connected to human needs and fancy or whatever. And why is this different from that? It's because whereas the material is following law, meaning it cannot be different than what it is, gravity cannot be changed, the resistance of materials, the way they combine and have some properties, that none of that can be changed, and all of that influences this project, whereas the way you're combining them come from rules. And rules are not things that you follow by necessity. Rules are things you could not follow, right? When I decide on a rule, I mean, I could behave otherwise. So why is this important? Because this is what separates the how of production from the what. And the difference between the how and the what, right, is kind of encapsulated on this arrow here. Because while nature determines these things in one way, it determines the social space of humans in a different way. And when this social space that has some natural dimension to it turns back on nature, it can actually benefit from more degrees of indetermination than natural laws, right? So like the material here, like wood, it's following a natural law of how wood behaves. The land, the instrument, like you cannot use the hammer any way you want. If you hit it too strong or too quickly, it might break or something like this. And you also have limited constraints on your effort that are all based on natural laws. But how you're going to combine these things come from rules. And they're not necessary. They are oughts, not needs. They could be otherwise, right? Yeah. That's the whole distinction. Like you could behave otherwise. So there is this underlying debate, and it's the basis of the debate called the ontology of labor debate, right? Whereas, how do we explain this arrow? Because this is the arrow that on the one hand is determining the appearance of humans out of nature, but on the other, the thing that appeared through nature now has a degree of freedom with regards to nature that these other things don't have. Right? Yeah. I mean, I saw your little smile because I mean you're very much into this, right?
This is my project. So yeah.
Yeah. So why is this important when you come to discussing capitalism? This distinction between law and rule. Because when you move to the capitalist process of production and the first stage of it, which is what Marx calls the formal subsumption, meaning these parts are pretty much preserved as they are, but they are repurposed in capitalism, but they're not recomposed by capitalism yet, right? What we get is a very similar situation. Let me see if I can. Yeah, you get a very similar situation. So you still have materials, land, instruments, effort, right? And some other stuff here. But this stuff is actually filtered through commodity. It was bought by money, this is bought by money, this is bought by money, and so on. And this is all bought by an equivalent amount of money. So the what is seen from the perspective of its equivalence with money, but the how of labor is seen from the standpoint of the future money needs to make. right? And this is how you explain surplus value. Labor was bought as its value, the watt of it is bought in accordance to M being equivalent to some amount of money, but how labor is going to be used is determined by the design based on profitability, not on the equivalence, right? So labor power is trapped between this way of being determined, right, and this way of being used, right? So the distinction between law and rule is kind of mimicked here in the distinction between equivalence law of value, right, and the actual rules of organic composition, which are not thought from the standpoint of money, but they're thought from the standpoint of this transformation of money into more money, which is capital, right?
Yeah.
So for example, from the standpoint of a person holding money, so if money as an object that sees the world, it sees means of production and labor power. But the same things seen from the perspective of capital, which is actually the standpoint of this arrow here, you don't see means of production and labor power. You see constant capital and variable capital. And you want to play with their connection so that this product actually is valued more than the stuff that went into it.
Yeah.
But you see how that distinction between rule and law, between what is naturally following from the determinations of the material by nature, and this minimal gap between nature and what is called second nature, or whatever you want to call it. Without that gap, right, if things could only be worked on under one law, you cannot combine wood with nails in many ways. You can only combine wood with hammer and an axe to create a chair in one way. There's no way you could recompose the production process. You would deeply limit the possibility, like you would limit real subsumption. You could only have formal subsumption, which is putting many people to do chairs, but you couldn't really exploit the production process. So that gap here is a very profound topic, right? In this debate, this passage here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would even add also maybe science and technology as another pair that maps onto this, because science studies kind of laws, right?
Yeah.
Kind of part of the earth, whereas technology is about kind of utilizing it for some how, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. So, I mean, when we talked about the transformation problem as being a big issue in Marxist literature, and that new developments should try to affect that problem, there is another classic problem, which is called the ontology of labor, because there are two ways to understand this. One is to say Marxism doesn't need this arrow. It doesn't have to have a theory of this. Capitalism actually retroactively makes it seem like this is an arrow and this is one thing and this is another thing ontologically, because it exploits capital is this perspective. So it's historically determined, and there is no such thing as labor as a sort of capacity for implementing designs that are not naturally given, right? A sort of capacity for negotiating with the laws of nature, but which are not determined by those laws. I mean, there is a very old sort of humanist ideology that is based on labor being this thing, right? The idea is that everything has properties and necessary attributes, but Prometheus gave us this gap, right? Prometheus gave us something which is called labor, that is an indistinct capacity for creating the designs of how we're going to negotiate with these laws and create things that are not determined by those laws, right? And actually, if you look at this system here, you see that everything receives a green arrow directly, right? There's actually a green arrow here as well. It's not, I mean, this green arrow here should go here as well, right? But not in the product. because the product would never appear without the intervention of the design, right? There is no connection between the product and Earth, because no spontaneous change, no interaction between natural systems would lead to the appearance of a Nike shoe, right? You need to intervene almost with a demonic force that can go against these laws, and at the same time that benefits from it, right? So there's a whole debate around this issue of should a new political vision have a theory of how something comes out, like something like rules emerge out of law? Should the name of this capacity for creating new rules that give you new designs on how to reorganize matter be called labor? Or is labor the modern name that was given to this under a very particular ideology, and some other name should be given, right? Because, for example, there is a sort of physical or thermodynamical commitment underlying all of this, which is also putting spontaneity here, right? Which is like entropic change. And everything that concerns the creation of forms or negentropic effort, right? Something that appears that is not spontaneous, right, is placed on the side of labor. So it ends up suggesting that labor is always orderly and always form creating, and nature is form destroying, right? So there's a lot of assumptions underneath this, and there is very little work done on trying to, just update this debate, right?
Yeah. I think this is very helpful because I think I was intuitively, going into that direction already in a sense. But you almost like made it explicit to me, like the specific part wherein within this discussion of Marxism, the stuff that I am studying can have some application, some purport.
And I think that, for example, one hypothesis we could explore, not only I know that this connects very nicely to the space of reasons debate with Sellers and everyone that's talking about.
Even Ray Brassier that, went to this, intermediary phase wherein he was mixing up, mixing Sellers and Marx and all that. Now he's into Adorno. I'm not getting into that, but but he was trying to use Sellarsian resources in order to read Marx, or vice versa as well, like changing Sellers' framework with the commodity form, the concept of ideology, and all, and different and real abstractions, different things that come from the Marxian tradition. So this was very interesting to me for quite a while now, but I was kind of disconnected from it for a while too. So this is just, I was just pointing at that. So
yeah, I think that this is a debate that definitely has a lot of resonance with what we're talking about, because, for example, one thing that goes against this the classic vision, then I would say, is that everything on Earth is determined by laws.
Right back.
Sure. Whereas for some reason, humans, because of something, and then you can call it whatever you want, like language, cooperation, or whatever quality that is always anthropologically very dodgy, you give it an exception and say humans are capable of choosing their own rules, or, as Marx says, anticipating the design before it's accomplished, or whatever you want, because we have some exceptional place, right? And then this arrow here is actually the arrow of a discontinuity, right? It's always about explaining why this thing is this rule following capacity is different from the law following, especially because we suppose that objects like matter a body following is not following the law of gravity, like the rule of gravity. It could not follow the rule of gravity, but it chose to follow it, right? It's the very thing it is dependent on following it, whereas rules make it seem like you could choose the rule you're following and still be who you are. So there is a degree of indetermination, right? And in Marxism, the classic way of explaining this is the humanist way, which is putting humans on the center and saying, yes, there is a break, there is some exception. Humans are capable of deciding which rule they will follow. And that's what makes human labor different from the labor of a bee. The bee makes effort, expends energy, and does create something that wouldn't appear spontaneously. But the very design of the bee is still spontaneous. The bee could not do what she's doing, right? So we put the beehive under spontaneous change and not as proper labor. So this is usually the metaphor, with labor being the name of this discontinuity, right? But I think that with the Bogdanov thing, but not only Bogdanov, and I think that part of it is also with what we're talking about with organizations as a sort of umbrella category. There is a different way to look at this, because Earth, like laws can actually be treated as a sort of huge organizations that it takes a lot of energy to change. It takes cosmic energy to change laws. But for example, there's a lot of physicists today who are studying the change in the natural laws through cosmic time. So the laws of the universe in the beginning are different than the laws of the universe today. And we can anticipate that they will change again in like some cosmically distant future. Because it's just such a huge organization with such a huge energetic cost. You don't change these things so easily. So they are like very, 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 very stable rules, but they still could be otherwise. It's not ontologically different. Whereas for our microcosmos of a brain, perhaps the energetic cost of changing is actually quite cheap. So one way of talking about this distinction between laws and rules is actually by thinking through the continuity of them, right? There are both entropic and negentropic processes in nature, and there are both entropic and negentropic processes in sociality, but there is some sort of continuum or a slightly different way of moving from general laws to social rules that could be thought in terms of the continuity, not of labor, but of, you know, being all forms of organization. So there might be actually a way of advancing that question as well. Like, and the transformation problem is nerd Marxism, right? It's Marxism for nerds, but the ontology of labor is Twitter Marxism. It's like people debate this on Twitter and they hate each other because of this sort of thing. So changing that would actually, having something new to say on that front could actually change a lot more, like, right? Even the problem of, sorry, yeah?
You at least get new followers.
Yeah, we would get at least new followers on Twitter. But I think that it also helps to solve one problem, which is because of the exceptional way that labor is thought, right, as being the only way, the ontology that explains why labor only appears here and nor anywhere else, is an ontology that actually also puts ecology in the background. Because everything that concerns nature is always a material to be worked on. Never, let's say, letting nature run its course is always a weak version. It's never the product of a work. A work is always something you do to nature, right? So there is some level of exceptionalism here that is hard to break from. And it's hard from two reasons, because when you try to, let's say, if this is the humanist version, there is a break between nature and second nature. Labor is an exceptional capacity that only humans have. You tend to create politics that privileges the labor point of view, employment, because the dignity of humans comes from labor. That's our essence. So, for example, basic rent, basic income, or things like this seem to be anti-worker, right? So that's the first difficulty. But the second difficulty is that people who try to just say, oh, there is a continuity, they also tend to downplay important things because they, I mean, the other problem is that rather than having an exceptionalism about human beings, it's not talking about the specificity of it and pretending there is nothing specific, because exception and specificity is different. And I mean, our brains are slightly different and the way we construct stuff is slightly different. I mean, that should count for something, right? So on the one hand, you have like the labor ontology, but the second option is to say there is nothing different. But it tends to be also quite ideological because the places you can hold on politically to do stuff, it's not as, I mean, when only humans can claim they are equal to other animals, but other animals can never claim they're equal to us. I mean, that's like the postmodern teacher that goes into the classroom and says, we're all equal here. But if the student raises and says, teacher, we're all equal here, the teacher can say, get out of the class. You're disrespecting me. Like, it's like false humility, you know?
Would you also say that's almost like the move Hayek makes, right? Like for him, there's almost only a law.
Yeah, I think he
and
has
that's the law of capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think capitalism. No wonder that some thinkers thought that neoliberalism is a sort of animalistic view, because it's very happy with the idea that, you know, society is just like anything. Humans are just like anything, just with perhaps some extra steps in the middle.
Yeah, I think these things like neoliberal thought, or you can find the same tendencies in much more far-fetched hypotheses like, you know, Nick Land and stuff like that. That's trying to ontologize capital as, you know, something that is, you know, either embedded in nature, like it was produced by nature, it is a force of nature or something like that, or you can embed in nature through the mediation of the individual, which is also something that will have a certain natural behavior, like in the Hayekian framework, or even I think the Mises one is even more developed in that sense. Like, what's the name of the thing? Pragmaticism or something like this. Yeah, that has certain laws that every individual necessarily follows and all that. And they are laws, really. They are not really rules. They are not really open to revision, open to intervention. It's like almost a natural law that is instantiated in the behavior of a what they call a rational individual. So there's a kind of a rational society that comes about through this, right? So, and it is all very assimilationist, like assimilated to nature in that sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't deal with specificity that much.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that is in common between both very neoliberal projects and also very hardcore leftist, non-specist projects is that the politics becomes the assumption of this equality with other beings. It's not like the thing you begin from and then you do some political project. Like, this sort of humility is the aim, is the goal in itself, right? To recognize that you're governed, like, for example, the idea that humans have some human nature that will always strive for profit. Like, politics ends at recognizing that and being humble about that and accepting that. But in some sense, like, I don't think Donna Haraway fits that exactly, but some other people who are working on politics that are not just human, but it's of nature and concerned with the Anthropocene, it seems like the end goal is to recognize that you are part of an environment with many species, many non-human agents, and so on. That's not the starting point to do something. It's not. Nobody's going to call an assembly with dogs and people.
Actually,
I'd love to see that, but I would like to see people actually give political power to other species. I don't see that happening for some reason.
No. It's kind of weird because you deflate the difference between the human and the natural, while at the same time the natural is always the inert thing. It's always the thing that is out there, and you have to negotiate with it in a sense. So this is kind of weird.
Yeah.
Like the only intervention that nature can have is like the intrusion of Gaia, that is a kind of the outcome of a natural law. So it's kind of weird. Like we are all the same, but the only one that has an obligation, something that it has to fulfill, like even an ethical obligation or a moral one, is the human. Like,
yeah. But you know what I love about it? Did you know that Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour are Christians? Like they never talk about this.
They are Catholic.
They're like, I think they're both Catholics.
Roman Catholic.
Roman. Yeah. She was in the church, like, and there is this sort of idea of like everyone is equal, but humans are to blame.
Wow. Yeah. This is an insight.
But I think that one thing that I think it's good to talk about this. Why is this interesting? Because they are right to see that there's something problematic with this first theory here. Like the break is way too strong to even for a human reality, like to always bet on labor as the thing that dignifies man actually gets in the way of politics, not only ecological politics, but also, I don't know, it might make you against basic income for the wrong reason, even if you might be against it for other reasons, or might get problematic in a post-work or a situation where there's not work for everyone. So it seems like they hear something true somewhere, but the solution might be too extreme on the other sense, because it's very hard to come up with a political construction based on that. So the hard thing is to, sorry, yeah?
Yeah, sorry. No, there's something to be said also about theory construction there, because it seems that some of these theories like animism and this sort of, let us call them flat ontologies, for that matter. Let us call them flat ontologies. They are not putting the politics into the theory. They are doing the theory in order to have a political effect, in a sense. Like they are offering metaphysics. And the thing is, if you adopt this metaphysics, some political effect will follow, because you will be more democratic towards, things and animals. But they are not putting the politics so much within the theory, in a certain sense. It seems to me, at least.
No, I tend to agree with you.
Like I remember that guy asking you in that conference, I am at the supermarket of ontologies.
Yes.
So what do I get if I buy Badiou's ontology? Like this kind of thinking. Like you're not so much. Of course, there is something to be said about advantages in philosophy. Like with that, we love that. I know you love too that phrase by David Lewis. Metaphysics does not prove anything. It fixes their price.
Yeah,
so
like
the price you have to pay in order to believe something. So I have to update my commitments in order to believe in such and such theory. Okay, there is some truth to that, but at the same time, there is this kind of grab bag attitude with ontology or with metaphysics, where when you adopt something in order to have a certain effect, but at the same time, the theory you're adopting is not complete enough, is not robust enough. It's only doing that.
It perfectly fits that metaphor. It's like buying the Nike. It's very pricey, but it shows off.
Yeah.
But my point here, just so I don't lose the, sorry?
I just wanted to say that probably in this framework, you can also embed Zizek and Badiou. I think both of them don't ontologize the relation between earth and social as having being a different substance, but as emerging out of earth due to inherent exception within earth itself, but in different
more, yeah.
Yeah,
in
this is
different
where I wanted
manners.
to get at, Reza. I think that's a perfect point, because I think that there are many people today concerned with a third arrow, which would allow us to do two things at the same time. Not be to agree with the theory of that there is no break, enough to say that there is no third thing, no intervention from God, nothing special or higher about the emergence of sociality and human consciousness and so on. It should be amenable to an immanentist, secular, non-spectacular treatment, but you want to be able to recognize that something is different. So it's very hard, but there are many attempts, but some of them are more naturalist. I think, for example, Adrian Johnston tries more of a naturalist side and say, well, that we can think of something which is inside of nature but separate from nature somehow. There is Zizek with a more, it's kind of a twist on the humanist story, right? Yeah, there's nothing good about humanity. It is like a accident in nature. It's like nature itself is weak and it couldn't prevent something that is too self-contained to appear, something like that. But there are many candidates, I would say, for this third thing here, which neither accept no break nor accept a clear break. So they wouldn't accept, for example, the idea that humans have nothing essential about them, nor would they accept that humans have something essential about them. And I think that there are many attempts here, right?
Badiou falls in that line as well.
Yeah, I think that he would fall there, but also I think the guy Caron mentioned, Ray Brassier. I think a lot of guys in philosophy of mind who take a more naturalist approach, try to think about it. But I think it's a big issue, and it ultimately concerns that problem that we're talking about, the relation between law and rule, right? Between having to follow some path because there is no other path, even if the connection between many of these paths produce indeterminate results, right? It's not about complexity of interaction. It's about actually contingency, right? You could have done otherwise. You could do that differently. Therefore, you are responsible, right? That sort of approach. And I think that there is something to everything we're talking about that does point to the idea that you can think through that distinction in terms of organization, right? Because there is a certain class of organizational structures and types that very much qualify to the name of law, whereas there are other forms of organization that are inside nature and that are not human, that you would say that follow rules, right? So for example, you can definitely see animals that are not simply blindly following instinct, they're clearly negotiating with the environment in the most sophisticated ways, and that actually imply history of behavior, right? And you can actually have almost like a continuum from natural laws that can only change over cosmic time to some sort of what we call instinct, but perhaps could have a better name for certain laws that abide to animals but change due to evolution and things like this, right? All the way to something we call social rules that seem to embed this plasticity in them. Like you could make a more continuum thing that keeps a difference and so on. I'm just saying this because this is a big debate inside of Marxism itself, right? This arrow here. And I think that it's a debate that is not simply like this is the metaphysics behind it and this is the political economy, because it actually, one thing relates to the other. For example, if you track Marx's thinking, in around 1844, when Marx wrote the philosophical manuscripts, he never published, but anyway, he had one theory of this. He had a theory of this thing called the generic being, right? The species being. And the theory comes from Feuerbach, but it's actually a development of the whole humanist tradition, which says that while, let's say, like nature is here and animals so you have a species and you have some particular animal here. This animal, when by surviving and reproducing, they are actually keeping the species alive. So the species is like an idea or an essence, but it's totally materially grounded on the practical existence of animals, right? And Feuerbach's idea was that, well, when humans use their intellect and their capacities to keep themselves alive in inventive ways, they're doing more than just to reproduce the species. They're actually changing the species they're part of. So we have what would qualify humans would be a capacity to change the species you're part of. And this is actually a meaning of generic that Badiou keeps, because the idea is there is some species and this is one animal that belongs to it. Like if you're a dog of a certain species, you have many dogs here, but ultimately they all have the same predicate, which is being of this species. With humans, you would have humanity and you have one human. But as humanity develops, this predicate no longer fits what these guys are doing, because what they did immanently changed the very meaning of what it means to be human, and you need a new predicate. So humanity would be an impredicative species, right? There wouldn't be a set of common behaviors to all of humanity that you can put under the title the human species, because we would change the species through labor. So Marx, in the beginning, around 1844, he adopts the theory of species being, because it actually solves a couple of problems, right? He, on the one hand, he had to explain why labor doesn't have a predicate, like why labor is an indistinct quality, right? You can work on anything. Labor is not determined by its object. It determines the object, right? And second, labor seems to be something that connects humanity immanently. So for example, if I invent a new object, we won't simply say Gabriel invented it. We'll be able to say humanity has the capacity to invent that. So it's also something that connects socially people in an immanent way, regardless of our mental state or concepts, right? So it fitted, the theory of species being explains these two things. It explains why labor is an indistinct capacity and why laborers are connected socially. Not because we want to be connected, but by nature itself. But by the time of Capital, you realize that these two properties can be explained without the reference to any metaphysics, because labor is indistinct due to the dispossession of means of production. So before the enclosure of land that ravaged throughout Europe and the whole world after some time, people didn't work on anything. They worked on specific things. There were shoemakers, there were people who harvest whatever, but there wasn't this thing called labor as an indistinct capacity. It's only once you materially have no access to the means of production that you sell your capacity in general. So that capacity in general is a historically specific abstraction. It's not a metaphysical abstraction. So that's the first point. And second, labor is not totally connected. What connects labor is the commodity form of labor, right? When you have the labor commodity, then what happens with a laborer in one part of the world affects what happens in the other in this social way. So Marx had no need for the generic anymore, and it disappears from most of his writing. He has no explicit theory of what is homogeneous to all human beings, because the two properties that he had to explain through generic labor or generic being are explained through historically specific concepts, which actually makes more sense because the very word labor didn't mean what it means in modernity before that time. So one thing also changes, because in 1844, the narrative of Marxism was humans are homogeneous, we have an essence, and private property makes us heterogeneous amongst each other through competition, all sorts of differences and estrangements and alienation. But in capital, the theory is actually the inverse. People are heterogeneous, and we have not even a measure of how different they are, and market and commodities make us homogeneous. So homogeneity is actually a product of capitalism. It's not a metaphysical condition. So Marx doesn't need generic species being as a sort of philosophical framework for everything. And you can see that some of the properties of species being become properties of capitalist mode of production. Species being is, the generic being is a being that has an indistinct capacity. No, the enclosure of means of production creates this abstract capacity. But generic beings are people who by their effort connect with humanity materially. No, but we do this because in a system that we are all private producers are connected through commodities. That's how we get connected, right? The reason why I'm starving in Brazil and somebody is doing something else somewhere else, that's actually the economic system that is connecting, coordinating these things. It could be that some people are inventing technologies in Africa I don't know of in pre-capitalist times that wouldn't affect me at all. They would become a new race. I would never, a new species, and I would never know, right? The idea that human beings are essentially homogeneous and that capitalism estranges us gets substituted for the theory that we are a bunch of strangers, in fact, or at least it's something we don't know what we are. And it's capitalism that creates the basic homogeneity, social homogeneity amongst us, right? So the analysis of this process here, right? The analysis of the material process of production and its economic consistency changed how Marx saw this arrow, right? In 1844, this arrow is called the generic. And after 1867 with capital, before that, in fact, but clearly at that point, he goes back and says, no way, man, this cannot be so easily described. You know, I think that Badiou is nicely connected to this because three properties are now on the side of capitalism: homogeneity, indistinctiveness or abstraction, and this sort of socially connectivity, right? And Badiou's theory of the generic is a theory of what is left outside. It's about singularity, is about something concrete and situated, and it is heterogeneous, right? There is not one capacity. You have many capacities, and they don't even fit to each other, and they're not even on human level scale. They are kind of separate from humanity, weirdly enough. They're more human than humans, right? Art, politics, and things like this. So it is kind of compatible with this problem. But I think that there is a big debate there. And I just made that kind of summary of it because it shows how developing this organizational point of view regarding political economy and regarding political practice itself, it can both inform how you do this sort of underlying metaphysics, right? And also be informed by it, because it's hard to for example, to make the claim that labor is a specific class of organizations, right? Labor reorganizes matter. Like, for example, this nice drawing here that we made we never got to present it, but it's a very nice part of category theory called resource theory, right? These guys, they just study how you can create the sort of structure of recipes, right? I think they're all reducible to symmetric monoidal categories or some terrible word like that. But for example, we tried our hand here on that schema, right? Constructing like how you create a light blue chair by combining these things in what order and how effort comes into it. When you start looking at this and decomposing labor in this way, you can even decompose the effort itself, because the effort is always also something that is brought in, recomposed in your body, and makes some energy available for spending. But the moment that we go into that direction of treating labor as a specific dimension of a large class of ways of organizing, the question of human exceptionality, why is there only labor? Why the only labor that can produce surplus is human labor and not animal labor, for example, or how ecology plays into it. All those things, all those questions that are sort of in the background, they are reopened, right? So there's a whole bunch of things to discuss also that comes from treating labor as a sort of as not being a primitive term that actually names a large class of heterogeneous ways of organizing things. We tried something with a machine, but it looks just too crazy to be understood. But yeah, we're probably going to try to develop that further. But all of this crazy sermon I just gave, it's based on that fact that I think that, yes, Sellers has something to say. I'm sure you could.
Yeah. That much I already knew, but thanks for that, because it fleshed out a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, but I do think that one big issue is that I know that you're interested in these several topics, but I haven't seen anyone, nor even Brassier or none of these guys, do the move from the sort of the law versus rule debate to a more, both to the Marxist version, which has to do with labor, but then to this extra point from labor to organization, which is.
Yeah, I thought Brassier was going in that direction at some point, but then I think things shifted again. I don't know. I was hoping to read his stuff on that, but yeah, this is something that interests me. I think I might go there in that direction with this group. I was going to make a proposal then. I wanted to present that paper I send you guys. It's not because I agree with it or because it's a fantastic paper or anything like that, but because it's very useful for introducing these framework, these problematics of Sallarsian stuff and all that, and analytic Hegelianism within a certain Marxist problematic. So I think that paper is really useful. So I would like to present that, and I would suggest that I present it on November 30, sorry.
Yeah, just add the date there. I mean, if it's not conflicting with anyone.
Yeah, I think no. So I was going to propose that, because the other, 2 weeks from now, I'm beginning at the new center, so it's not good. And yeah, lots of stuff to do until the 25th. But the 30th, I don't have class the 29th, and the 30th I could present something. And this is quite easy for me to present, because there's a lot of information in things that I already know, like Sellers and Brandom and McDowell and all of that. And then there's a Marxist debate. There's even a debate with analytic Marxism that I think is quite interesting, because the interesting thing is that with the advent of analytic Hegelianism, the Marxist shift that could come about from the analytic Hegelianism would necessarily be against analytic Marxism. So there's this whole debate there, which is quite nice. So
that's interesting. So anyway, I think that there is a lot of stuff there we could also. I thought it was a good thing to just to kind of mention and have a cursory debate on this. Just because you were saying that you were having also some kind of trouble seeing how we would fit into it, and also I thought it would be good to just I mean, as if we don't have enough doors open in the project to also open an extra door on that problem.
Yeah. I didn't mean like that. I didn't mean like a big problem. I knew I would come up with something, you know, but it was just taking time, just that.
No, of course, but I think it's an interesting thing. There's not only does it connect with the Bogdanov thing. Bogdanov is a guy who will propose a very specific answer to that problem, right? For him, the only distinction between, like, it's in that little schema I was presenting. I think the windows are still open, right? For him, the trick is to move the how from here to here. So the question of how to do things is not a question about humans. It's just that there is some specific how that leads to the production of this. So if you connect the wires in a weird way, you know, you get this weird group of people. But the what and the basic how is also natural. So for him, there is even a point, I was talking to Dennis about this yesterday, I think. Like, there's a moment in technology, he says selection is an important law of organizations, but we don't need to use the Darwin term natural selection, because there's no distinction for us here between natural and artificial when it comes to organization. So for him, like, the fact that some ideas survive in your mind, the fact that some animals survive in an environment, there is like a formal concept of selection that is kind of broad enough to account for all of that. And, it's changed by the material of the organization and the specific form. So natural selection has nothing to do with how ideas get selected, but that has not to do with ontology, but just with the fact that the world of ideas is different than the world of some animals. But it is kind of a logic of worlds in general, right? So I think it touches on his ideas as well. A lot of stuff from neuroscience, I think, is also debating this sort of how could something indeterminate come from nature, right? So there is a fit there, I think.
Yes. Speaking of that that quote, which I was really impressed by, this idea of selection. I think one category that we should consider when it comes to labor is the fact that labor is very amenable to the form of private property. So you can sell your labor because it's easy to see, easy to trace it back to the individual body, right? But there's like organizational forms where it's not so easy to trace back who caused what, like, you know, like who in the organization caused what, because it's, on some sense, there's a causal forces, or maybe you can call them repertoires, right, within the organization that have their own effect that cannot be traced back to an individual. And those things have value in a way, but not in the capitalist sense, right? Like, you cannot exchange them. So so I think that's a concrete gain or benefit we get from adopting this viewpoint of organizations, is that we can start to count value in the organizational structure itself. But yeah, going back to the idea of selection, we can also think of organizations as kind of these organisms that, because of the rule of private property, organizations have to take a certain form, right? Which is the business form. The form of the business is like an accretion of organizational stuff that respects the law of competition, right? So businesses are kind of like this manifestation of private property laws, and it's kind of like an extension of natural laws, which is almost like the ideological thing that people say in business, you know, like survival of the fittest, you know, but I think there's a reading there that doesn't have to be so ideological, right? That we can use from Bogdanov. Yeah, maybe we can adopt or recuperate this idea of selection to talk about organizations. As something like that.
Yeah, actually, I think it fits what I want to present next week. I'm gonna send you guys. By the way, you're gonna get I have the Portuguese version of the text, but I'm gonna do like a Google Translate and just some fine tuning of the English version. But the basic topic of next meeting, actually, now that I think of it, connects with that, because the stuff that we were developing is the idea that taking that Karatani structure of many modes of exchange and giving it some more specific structure, so different modes can be effective at different scales, mixed in different ways, so on. We're trying to show that, well, that kind of constrains how organizations, like some ways of combining these modes are more adapted to an environment, some ways are less adapted. So for example, in a political culture where most of the power circulates institutionally, an organization that has some institutional front tends to have a more stable place or more effectivity, whereas you can start discussing this sort of, I didn't think in those terms, but it does have a sort of selective aspect to it, because it does concern a bit how organizational structures fit or don't fit or get into tension with a more general social environment, right? So it's true that actually has more to offer, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think we can kind of pinpoint political economic decisions as at this intersection of like changing the rules of selection and also designing kind of local solutions to constraints, something like that.
Actually, there's even a topic that Hansel actually wrote a lot of cool stuff on this, because in that notes that you wrote on politics, because the one thing that we haven't really been able to arrive at, but I think it's also because it's very hard to get the right feel for it, which is how do you discuss causality politically, right? We know that one way we know how to talk about causality politically, or more specifically in political economy, is by the way that quantities or scarcity or abundance of one commodity might affect the supply chain, for example. There's a sort of ripple in commodity space that has a sort of causal effect. You can talk about transformations or, for example, crises as being the sort of effect of previous moments or a sort of dynamic equilibrium. We can talk about these things, but it's hard to talk about causality in terms of politics or political organization. And it seems like the theory of passing constraints on, right? It's very connected to the theory of causality. Like Dennis yesterday was giving the example of copyleft, because the guys from the Telecommunist Manifesto, from the Venture Commune project and so on, they also talk a lot about it, right? And copyleft is not really just a way to suspend rights, because if you suspend property rights on something, somebody else can take them, right? You don't really constrain any future events by suspending property rights. But if you create copyleft, you're passing on the constraint of things remaining common. So if somebody does something with the thing you did, that thing now is also common, right? It's a different approach, I think. And that whole issue of passing on constraints has a lot to do with selection as well, right? Finding a form.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, like the copyleft is like if you think about it in a kind of genetic sense, it's like you're passing on a trait to anything that you develop with a copyleft license. It cannot be privatized. So it is like kind of this short circuit between the layers of what we call like the TB, right? The contracts layer and the economic layer. Because you create this kind of wall around it so that, you sustain the commons by creating more things with copyleft. So yeah, I think that's a great example of a selection approach or a selection viewpoint towards political economy.
And I mean, I think that a good example of this in political economy, for example, in Capital, when Marx arrives at industry, he starts describing industry. He says something that I think is very counterintuitive if you think he's like an ethicist guy concerned with teleology, because he says that the biggest development from the appearance of factories was not factory work, but its effect on all other works. Right. So, for example, factory work works at a certain rhythm, at a certain level of production. It requires some consumption of material on some rate. But the people who are providing that material for the factory are not organized as factories. They're organized like domestic labor, manufacturers, small properties. And now the factory is constraining that productive chain, that supply chain. So it's not the new thing that is the most affected. Now everything are factories. But the moment that there are some factories, manufacture and domestic labor are transformed into what he calls modern domestic labor and modern manufacture, which is totally different. Like the best example is definitely modern slavery. It's very different to have a plantation in America when all it's trying to do is to create a surplus that owners can enjoy. And when it's creating a surplus to kind of compete with other productions of cotton around the world, slaves are much, much more tortured by that system. But it's not the slave system that changed. It's just that there is a factory and there's a ripple of constraints on the production supply due to that. Right?
Yeah, and it's even a way to locate the body in the exam, in the sense that we're talking about it, right? A body is something that allows the rippling of constraints.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like things that didn't depend on each other before starts depending, right? So there is a very nice development to be had there, perhaps, because passing constraints, which is partially can be treated, we already know from that very cool text on passing constraints, I think called the Mereology of Behavior. How is it called?
Yeah, I don't remember, but I can find it, yeah.
There's a really cool text by some guys who work on the same formal material we were talking about that treats causality and causal space in terms of passing constraints along. And they use the same...
That was the David Spivak paper,
David
right?
Spivak guy, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably something we could talk about also to develop this. I mean, and again, it's crazy because the Spivak stuff connects with whole stuff on transition matrices to talk about, again, passing of constraints and probability space. And it seems like it very naturally connects with this idea that when there is some change in a body, like phenomenological body, it changes the relations of dependency between other parts of that world, right? And I think that this fits perfectly because whole part of the issue of competition in capitalism is precisely the relation between organic recomposition of capital and how that ripples amongst capitalists, right? Once some department of economy starts changing how it organizes constant and variable capital through new machinery, new technology of organization, and so on, you're obliged to follow in some sense. You cannot just remove yourself from it. The constraints are actually passed along, right?
Yeah, and going back to Marx too, yeah, this idea of relative surplus as relative surplus doesn't happen in isolation. It is kind of exactly the same thing where you put a constraint on other individual capitals when you add a new technology, right? I don't know. It seems to have the same. It's like an ecosystem thing, right?
Yeah, I think that it's really, it really functions. Like we can really see how to bring these things, I think, together. You know.
Just one thing, Marx says that this way of passing constraints can be called laws of competition, laws of the tendency of the profit rate to fall. So
yeah,
perfect.
it goes back to that. Yeah, it even goes back to that other thing. Yeah. I really like this idea, and I love it that there is a Brazilian. I don't really understand his philosophical texts, but there is a Brazilian physicist called Marco Novello who is together with a bunch of others. I mean, it's an international project, and pretty much their basic assumption is this: that laws of nature are very costly rules. Like they're changeable, they're contingent, they could be otherwise. It's just that they're rules implemented as a cosmic scale. To change them costs the universe, but that doesn't mean they're built into the building blocks of everything. Like they changed already through time. They might change again in some deep cosmic time. So there is this nice idea that, for example, very complicated organizations like the rippling of innovation in capitalism, it's very costly to change. Yeah. You need to change the energy that needs to be changed. It's like the energy of the whole social world. So you call it a law, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't need to assume that it's more naturally substantial because of that, right? You call it natural because the ratio between cost and regularity is very difficult to move, right? It's a nice idea. Yeah. Anyway, guys, I need to go as well. I need to cook, but yeah, I'll send. I wrote down the stuff we talked about for future plans. I'll put them all in our WhatsApp group so we can continue to debate them there.
Okay, sounds good.
Yasha and Danny, good luck tomorrow for both of you and for all of us.
Yeah, good luck indeed.
Good luck to you as well.
Yes.
Yeah, good luck.
See you guys.
All right, bye.
Take care.
Take care.